Do you want to jumpstart your innovation? Applications are open for the 2022 Rosamond Innovators Program. Connect with people who can speed up your scale-up in health tech. Subject matter experts, clinicians, partners, and investors. Deadline to apply is April 11th. Visit rosamondinstitute.org to learn more.
So we do feel that there always will be a level of messiness that will be there just because it's being generated in the real world, that until there is a standardized approach to data entry, that it'll always exist, first and foremost. Number two is the fact that as long as you have strong clinical guidance in trying to parse out that data, is that it'll probably get you further down the path to where you need to be than if you didn't have that strong clinical guidance.
And now, from San Francisco and the UCSF Rosamond Institute, the Health Technology Podcast with your host, Christine Winoto.
Our guest today, Dr. C.K. Wang, has always wanted to have an impact on patient care, which is why he left the clinic to develop larger scale solutions and help more cancer patients choose the right treatment based on data. As COTA Healthcare CMO, he's doing just that. Through their analytical approach, COTA Healthcare is committed to making cancer care data-driven and the most simple it can be. Today, we talk about how CK is using his love of AI and oncology experience at COTA. We also discuss how COTA is making cancer treatment easier for the people going through the worst time of their lives. Here's our conversation. Welcome, CK. Thank you for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Christine, for having me.
And so excited to hear about your story about COTA Healthcare as well. And I thought it would be interesting. I mean, you have, interesting background. At the same time, it's also not common. Like you're a trained oncologist, but you've gone to the industry and now you're at COTA Healthcare. Can you tell us more about your journey, how you get to where you are, and why you want to be in the industry rather than being a clinical doctor?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, as you highlighted, I started my career almost 15, 16 years ago in full oncology practice. And, I had a slightly different approach to my practice than I think most practitioners, most oncologists out there. And that was the fact that I was given chances to actually learn the business of cancer care. And so through my time in practice, it spanned about 11 years, I had, many opportunities to help develop cancer programs, start cancer offices. So very different perspective. And as I completed the first decade of my practice, it was, call it a midlife crisis or what it may, but looking at the last decade of my life, looking forward to, the next decade of my life and my career, and understanding the challenges in oncology and cancer care and patient care that surrounded me at that time. The question that I asked myself was, could I see myself doing what I'm doing right now, day to day, in the next, for the next 10 years and in 10 years from now? And at that time, the answer was a clear no. And it was based upon, many different factors. I think primarily driven by the fact that I saw that my, at that time, being a clinician, my actual impact, right, was confined within the four walls surrounding my clinic and my office. And I wanted to have a greater impact on the patient care. And so that led me to explore other opportunities. And incidentally, or maybe not so much by accident, at that time, I came across what looked to me at that time to be quite a puzzling I was a little confused by what the job was looking for, but this was actually Watson Health. For those of you who remember Watson Health, And at that time, and this would have been about 6 years ago, Watson Health was looking to apply artificial intelligence in the space of cancer care to help improve the care of cancer patients. And I thought that was a very novel way of trying to solve for a problem, because if you look at many studies over the last 5 to even 10 years, there is a prediction, I think we're there now, of a shortage of oncologists, right? The baby boomers are getting to that age where they're developing cancers. Many oncologists are reaching that age where they're actually dropping out of the workforce. And so I saw this technology as a way to potentially help facilitate patient care. And also at the same time for me to learn a completely different, what was and remains, right, a huge focus when it comes to tech. And that is AI, machine learning, natural language processing. So that's after a long debate. It was a really long debate, a lot of soul searching, so to speak. I left full-time practice at that time, and was at Watson Health for 5 years. And what I learned, and I joke about this today, is the fact that I probably know more about artificial intelligence than your oncologist should ever know. And as many of us know, the output from this technology, this group of technology, is based upon the quality of the data on which it was trained, right? Mm-hmm. So after spending 5 years on the technology front, I developed a very strong desire to understand where that data is coming from, and to hopefully, especially with my clinical background and in the oncology world, hopefully participate and hopefully contribute to the actual improvement of that data, right? So that data that is being used going forward is as sound as possible. And that's what led me to COTA at that time. And I've been here at COTA for going on 3 years now.
Yes. Thanks for sharing that, which gave me a lot of questions. You mentioned about there's a lot of things that you learned being doing your clinical practice that make you feel like you can do more beyond just providing care to your patient, that get you excited about technology. What are those factors that trigger you to like, okay, this is something that I should explore more outside my clinical practice?
Absolutely. So I think the one instance that comes to mind, and this is a story I've told many times, was that I had a patient and he was a healthy, middle-aged Asian male who was diagnosed with colon cancer on his first screening colonoscopy. It was a locally advanced, what we call locally advanced cancer, and he had surgery. And he was in my clinic at that time, trying to decide on what the next best steps for him were. And at that time, and as it is today, the standard of care for a patient such as him throughout the world was to receive 6 months of chemotherapy after surgery. Well, not surprisingly, he did not want chemotherapy. He's a 50-some-year-old male, has a business to run, travels quite a bit, and really in the prime of his business and his life, and really didn't want to undergo 6 months of intensive therapy and also potentially sustain the what could be lifelong lasting side effects from the treatment. And so he asked me many questions, and not saying that this is the first time patients had asked me similar questions, but it was the first time where the questions really left a huge impact in the way I think about oncology and the entire clinical trial mechanism, right? And that was that, hey, Dr. Wang, that's great. I understand this is the standard of care throughout the world, but can you tell me more about that study? How many of those patients in that study were like me, Asian, middle-aged, healthy? And I honestly did not know the answer at that time. And right there in clinic, I told him, hey, let's let's look into the literature. Let's pull up the study. I pulled it up. It was an old study that was done in the early 2000s. And to my surprise at that time, and even in retrospect, also still very surprised, is the fact that the study did not disclose the types of patients that they actually enrolled in the study. I couldn't answer his question at all. And so I would say probably the only demographic breakdown that it provided were the sex and the age ranges of the patients. Well, probably not surprisingly, he wasn't very satisfied with my answer. And what I could find, he subsequently went for a second opinion and a third opinion, which all recommended exactly what I recommended. And, these are, international, world-renowned cancer centers. And he subsequently came back and says, Dr. Wang, I don't think I'm going to get that treatment that everyone's recommending. I understand I'm taking my chances. It's a 50-50 chance, but I'm willing to take it. And the good thing is the last time I saw him, which is 4 years later, he was still disease-free. So one could say that He made probably the right decision for himself. But I was really left with this big dilemma, right, of the fact that here I am practicing oncology based upon data that was not the most clear, right? And so that presented itself as a challenge to me at that time, is how can I impact, right, the greater cancer care or the greater healthcare ecosystem on a larger scale. And interestingly, as you and many people know today, right, the discussions about racial diversity, right, whether it's in cancer trials or any research in healthcare, right, is a big focus, especially out of what transpired last year with COVID. And I think that is, that has been a great focus, but I still think that it's a great thing that we're talking about it today more and more. But I think it's important. It's a very important topic that we need to continue to focus on going forward as well.
Yeah. So it's I'm glad that he made that decision, but at the same time, pretty gutsy, because oftentimes people tend to follow what the doctor tells them to do. Question on your experience, your time at Watson Health. Tell me more about that. So you make that transition. You feel like going to Watson Health can help you make a difference in terms of the data part, I'm sure, and learning about the AI. What, I guess, Watson Health seems to be like, everybody talk about it, but it seems like kind of like a big black box. Being the insight, maybe can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so absolutely. So the goal, right, of Watson Health at that time was to leverage artificial intelligence, Watson, that was previously developed, and try to see if Watson can help usher in a new era of basically technologies and platforms that can assist doctors at the point of care. And now that was the project that I was focused on. Watson was being used, in many different facets. One to help try to match patients to clinical trials. One to help drug companies potentially, find potential new targets as they go down the R&D, path. But mine was specifically to help oncologists make hopefully better decisions. Or to confirm that they made the right decision. And that was very, very appealing to me. And at the beginning of our discussion, I had highlighted that there were factors happening at that time in the oncology world that also, pushed me, right, down this path. And that was the fact that back then and today, even more true, is this explosion of new therapies. New, very novel therapies, right, for the treatment of cancer. And one can say that depending on which disease you're talking about, these new discoveries and approval and actual drug approvals have happened at such a pace that I, as a practicing oncologist, was not sure how practicing doctors were able to keep up with that data going forward, or would be able to keep up with that data. So the promise of a new technology, in this instance, AI, to help guide that decision making, was, really, made sense to me, made a lot of sense to me. And it still makes a lot of sense to me today. And so that said, the project at that time was to help develop these, what we call clinical decision support, right? Responses for oncologists at the point of care. And what I did during that time, I was one of the earlier oncologists. Well, I was one of the few oncologists that joined the project earlier on. So even though I joined a team that was supporting our customers, I had the opportunity to learn a lot about the different components of the technology, the actual, technology behind, the actual products, and also to work with folks that were actually working on refining that product.
Cool. And so my next question, maybe you can tell us a bit more about COTA Healthcare and what drawn you to join COTA Health.
Sure, absolutely. I had known about COTA for actually quite some time now. And what appealed to me and what I found, fascinating about COTA was its promise, or I would say its work to try to make sense out of all the clinical data that oncologists like myself back in practice were putting in as part of, routine patient care. This is what we call real world data, right? Real world data is any data that is actually generated outside of a clinical trial setting. So COTA was founded 10 years ago by a group of oncologists who essentially wanted to understand how cancer patients were being cared for in their practice, and quickly realized that a lot of the information that we're looking for, much of that information were residing in the unstructured format within the patient's medical record. Unstructured meaning they are essentially free text information. And and the reason why they wanted to understand how patients were being cared for was the fact that they hoped that understanding the care patterns amongst their providers can help them decrease unwarranted variation in cancer care, and hopefully thus leading to improved patient outcome and hopefully decreased cost of care. The concept, what we call today as value-based care. And so that was how COTA came to be. And that vision and that use case of the data, I found it very appealing, as I was one of those clinicians that was generating all that data. And I historically have thought about the I've thought about the medical record system today as sort of a dresser drawer with a lot of different drawers, and we're just shoving data into one drawer here and there and everywhere. And before I can't find where that data went, right? And so we're frantically pulling out all the different drawers to find it. And at the end of the day, I cannot make any sense of that data. That was actually the premise of the it was called the High Tech Act of 2009, that essentially accelerated clinical medical record system adoption as we know it today. One of the promises, right, of an actual repository of medical records is the fact that we can glean insights and use them to better understand what is going on in the real world, and hopefully using that knowledge, all of that insight, to help facilitate drug discovery or improve patient care. And I will say that since the passage of the High Tech Act in 2009, we haven't really fully realized the potential of this data. And as COTA was working in the depth of that data, it really, I was really drawn to it, right, to better understand how we can make better sense and essentially curate better data, and to help the healthcare industry, better use this data that we're actually pulling together.
This podcast is sponsored by Brown Rudnick's Global Life Sciences Group, a team of legal professionals that help life science companies, lenders, and investors around the world turn good science into good business. Learn more at brownrudnick.com. This podcast is also sponsored by Canon Quality Group. Canon Quality Group has been helping medtech startups set up quality management systems for over 10 years. If you're unsure when to get started with quality management in your startup, turn to the experts at canonqualitygroup.com.
You mentioned earlier about the outcome from the analysis that is based on what the data that you have, the quality of data that you have. And you earlier saying, patient data oftentimes is, like you're saying, a free data, oncologists type in what care they provide and how much cleanup do you have to do in order to put it in an organized way that can help you make an informed decision?
That's an excellent question, Christine. I would say that the effort today remains quite high until clinicians are documenting in a standardized format. I think there'll always be a certain level of cleanup. And I would say that most of the clinical records that have been generated over the last decade, most of them were generated for a very different use case.
Right.
And that was essentially to help doctors get paid. And they weren't used to really drive anything else but that. And so what we have found is that the older the data, the more, quote, messy it is. And there are times where we just cannot make sense out of it. However, even the more recent data can be messy, and it's by no fault. It's really no one's fault. I would say that I myself probably caused many of these issues too. I had a busy clinic. I didn't really go back to proofread what I put in, and before you know it, I put in information that basically either didn't make sense or in when it comes to the oncology care, I've essentially assigned 2 different stages to a patient's cancer, and so the effort is quite high. And at the end of the day, what's absent will be absent, and it's almost impossible to go back to, quote, fill in the gap. Now, then this is where we here at COTA believe that because these records are being generated by a clinician in a clinical setting, it's very important that what we do when it comes to data abstraction, when in the process of pulling out this data, is that it is guided by folks who have clinical understanding of the subject matter. Because it's truly at that time when someone like myself, right? Let's say in that one example that I highlighted with 2 different stages for a patient, is that many times it requires someone like myself, along with my team, to go back into that record to try to figure out exactly what is the correct staging. And many times we can find the right staging. It was just something that clinician at that time just accidentally, left it in. Maybe it's an old staging that they forgot to remove. And so we do feel that there is there always will be a level of messiness that will be there just because it's being generated in the real world, that until there is a standardized approach to data entry, that it'll always exist, first and foremost. Number 2 is the fact that as long as you have strong clinical guidance in trying to parse out that data, is that it'll probably get you further down the path to where you need to be than if you didn't have that strong clinical guidance.
So I'm just trying to understand, like going back when COTA just started, I'm sure that they get the data from some organization as point 0, and then using that data to build the algorithm. And what you're saying, the clinical guidance, that's when it comes to with something that's more like cleaner information that to overlay on the patient data, even though the patient data can be messy. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. So think about it as data transcription. That's probably a very straightforward way of thinking about it, that you have a source data, but that data has to be transcribed or transformed into a structured format. And that transcription today is happening, right, both with technology and actual individuals looking at that clinical information and essentially transcribing that fact out of the EHR with the medical record system into the structured format. And it's during that process that we approach it with a very heavy clinical lens, so to speak. And so that we can hopefully, at the end of the day, abstract the information that makes the most sense.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a little bit about the value-based care. So what is the value proposition for COTA product for the payer and for the providers, which eventually impact the patient outcome?
Absolutely. So today, most value-based care models, or many of the value-based models that we have participated in here at COTA, have involved both a payer and a provider who are working together to navigate that journey together. And historically speaking, payers only have insight into what is happening at the point of patient care through claims data. And claims data is very elementary from my perspective. It only tells you a transactional, or gives you a transactional picture of what's happening on the ground. And it may not be accurate because the coding could be off, or it may not be complete. And so most payers will tell you they can glean very little into exactly the nature of these patients on the ground from claims data. In order to have a better understanding, right, that's when the clinical data comes in. That's where COTA's abstraction of that clinical data comes in. That, look, I'm going to use a hypothetical example here. This institution, is giving a lot of expensive chemotherapy. Why is that the case? And it could be the fact that perhaps these patients have more advanced disease, more complicated disease, but that information is hidden in that clinical information that you cannot glean from the claims data. And so that's where this data is being used, is to help payers better understand why a provider is doing what they're doing. And I think probably one thing to say is that, cancer care is expensive, period. And it's probably, most of the care that's being delivered is probably warranted, right? What we're trying to do, I think the concept of value-based care, right, is essentially, as the name states, is to deliver the highest value for the cost. And this is a very nuanced and very difficult discussion that typically happens between the payer and the provider at the time of the discussion. But I would say, though, that I think value per cost is, in my opinion, it's a philosophical debate, right? It gets down, not just philosophical, but, ethics, right? It's very difficult, especially when it actually afflicts, especially when you're talking about a potential life-threatening disease. So that's why the more information one has to make a decision, i.e. the clinical data, we feel the better it is, so that everybody in that discussion can hopefully work toward the actual desired outcome.
So maybe help me understand the current situation right now before COTA. So when somebody has a cancer, they want to see the doctor, the provider said, you need to get this XYZ treatment. And then they got that treatment and they filed a claim. And then the insurance company, the payer, look at it. It's like, okay, this patient has this disease. This is the treatment. Well, I think we do reimburse for this sort of treatment. And then we make that payment. Is that how current? So how, with this new information from that COTA provide, how is that going to change how the payers behave versus how the providers behave?
Sure. No. So this data, I think the discussions about value-based care is, in my opinion, still very early on. There's been many attempts throughout recent history of medicine of trying to control cost. And I think this is just a sort of a new version of the same discussion, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And now what the focus is trying to assign value to a certain certain item, so to speak, or certain dollar value, right? And also to understand and to hope that that providers are giving the right treatment at the right time to patients. So this information is to essentially help align the payers with the providers so that the payers can say, yeah, your cost may be very high, but your care is appropriate, right? Whereas before, they would never know if it's appropriate or not. And obviously, this data can arm the provider to ensure themselves that their doctors are doing the right thing, right? Because I think that providers at the end of the day really are here to do the right thing. And we all believe we're doing the right thing. We're the best thing for our patients. But in a way, without that data to really back that up, it's just someone's gut feeling, right? And we feel that, data in that instance could be very powerful.
Mm-hmm. So going back to your time when you tell me the story about your patient that decided to forego the treatment, how does the technology that COTA has helped to come to that same conclusion without having that patient feel like, okay, I'm going to do my own research and homework?
No, absolutely. So what we do here at COTA is that we work very frequently with oncologists, and we essentially abstract all records for a given disease, and we put it in that structured format so that that provider's data science team could make sense out of it, right? And this is what I consider to be, I would say, the holy grail, where the ultimate use case of real world data is to help drive decision making at the point of care. So this data is essentially returned back to the provider so that they can understand how care delivery is happening. Now, I think that to better understand this, I think it's important to know that even though the practice of medicine is guided by clinical trial evidence, there's a lot of gaps in that evidence. A lot of gaps that no matter how hard you search, you will never find an answer. And it's because of the fact that clinical trials are designed with very specific questions in mind, right? And so the premise, right, of the value of real world data is the fact that despite the inability to find evidence to support how you would care for a patient in that scenario, the doctor is doing something no matter what, whether it is her anecdotal experience, consulting with a colleague or an expert. Something has to be done with the patient. And that it is when you aggregate that information together, then you start filling in the gaps between the clinical trial data, right? So now, hypothetically speaking, let's say if I had access to all of my practice's trial, all of my practice's clinical data for colon cancer at the time when the patient asking that question. It's foreseeable that I can say, actually, over the last 5 years in my practice, in our practice, we have seen X number of patients like you, and how many of them chose therapy, how many of them didn't, and how they did. Mm-hmm. And that is really, truly, I think, and as an oncology provider, I think that would be so wonderful if we're able to provide that type of information back to the provider and back to the patient.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much. That was, I learned a lot from how all this data works, and I'm very hopeful, optimistic, because you're saying this is still the beginning of utilizing all the real patient data for a lot of the decisions. So I'm looking forward that by the time I'm get some diseases at some point of my life, hopefully things are have a lot more resources for a lot more people. Well, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Christine.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Health Technology Podcast. We want to thank our executive producer, Herminio Neto, and our podcast engineer, Andrew Rojek. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. The Health Technology Podcast is available on all major platforms.